Good afternoon, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. Stacie Pettyjohn, the Director of the Defense Program here at the Center for a New American Security. Today, we have a first hybrid Fireside chat that is in-person and virtual in the post-pandemic era. I'm very pleased to have with us today General Nicholas Carter, the UK Chief of the Defense Staff. General Nick, welcome, and thanks for joining me. I've been really looking forward to our conversation. Before we dive into the substance, I'm going to run through a few quick administrative notes. We are recording this conversation and it will be posted on our website after it concludes. We're going to reserve 15 minutes at the end of our discussion today for our questions from the audience. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so in the chat box next to the video stream, but also be aware that we do not take anonymous questions, so be sure to identify yourself. With that, I'm going to kick things off by turning it over to General Carter for a few opening remarks.
Now, Stacie, thank you. And it's a great pleasure to be with you this morning and also to be doing it physically because we've all had to struggle with the hybrid piece and the virtual piece up until now. What I thought I'd do, though, is to give you a bit of my take on our perspective on the geostrategic context as it is at the moment. And I think what's interesting for me, who grew up during the Cold War, is how the world has moved from a relatively straightforward bipolar world when even I, as a young platoon commander in West Germany, knew exactly where my fire trench would be in the event of the inner German border being penetrated by the opposition. We moved through that relatively straightforward period into a world where it was a unipolar world, benign intervention, then of course terrorism. And of course we've now come out of the period of focus on terrorism into what is now a multipolar world, and we're in this era of constant competition. And I think that's very challenging for those of us who are operating at the sort of pole mill level, at the strategic level, and I'll come back to that. Within that competition, of course, we're up against what I would call assertive authoritarian rivals. And here I would talk about Russia from our perspective being the acute threat, China being more of the chronic or systemic challenge in all of this. And of course, our rivals tend to see the global strategic context as a continuous struggle in which all of the instruments of statecraft, whether that might be nuclear weapons at one end or diplomacy at the other, can be used unconstrained by any distinction between peace and war. And of course what they're trying to do is they're trying to achieve their objectives short of bringing on a hot war. And therefore we see these fait accompli strategies occurring in their regions and more broadly across the world. And of course it's a bit like the analogy of the boiling frog. And there is a risk, I think, that we'll be boiled by that, boiled like the frog, unless we wake up to it. And of course, we've also got an evolving US strategic posture, which as US allies we're needing to take account of and think about what that means to this. And of course, all of this is overlaid by the enduring threat of violent extremism, which may well have been emboldened as a result of what took place in Afghanistan in August this year. And then if you then look at the multilateral system, that's been challenged by our rivals, but also it's been challenged by the many global problems that it needs to solve at the moment, whether that's climate, whether it's pandemics, whether it's biodiversity, or indeed the new domains of space and cyber, which perhaps are not as well regulated as they might be and need to be regulated. And then I think from a military perspective, we're very conscious that the character of warfare is evolving apace, as indeed is the character of politics. And that I think is driven very much by the pervasiveness of information, but also rapid technological change. Change, I suspect, that's greater than the change we saw in the two world wars combined of the last century, and it's gathering pace every day. And of course that's removed the distinctions between peace and war, between foreign and domestic policy, between virtual and reality, between state and non-state. And of course it's enabled our rivals to use new tools, tactics and techniques to achieve their objectives below that threshold of war, what we could perhaps call grey zone or hybrid. And here of course disinformation is very obvious, but they've also got the opportunity to use undersea warfare, cyber, space, chemical and biological weaponry. And these things are very hard to attribute. And when you then add to that proxies and militias, and we've seen the Wagner group is alive and well doing what it does in 30 to 40 countries of the world at the moment, that is a very deniable capability. And although it can be traced back to Mr. Prigozhin, the extent to which the government can deny it is a very clear problem for us, I think. And then if you add to it the way in which I think our rivals have very thoughtfully studied our way of warfare and have worked out how they can challenge our weaknesses and play to their strengths and Hypersonics is a particularly good example of that, as is undersea warfare. And that means that they're able to use good old-fashioned military coercion, as well as the new techniques and tactics that we see below the threshold of war. And then if you add to that, I think, some of the ways in which politics are evolving at the moment. Of course, Fukuyama's book, The End of History, very much talked about how democracy will die from within. And of course, increasingly, politics is nationalist, it's populist, and of course, it's bellicose. And so many of the leaders these days don't necessarily remember the horrors of war. And when you add to that the fact that many of the diplomatic instruments that guided us through the Cold War in terms of arms control and mutual understanding, these have withered over time. I think that for our generation, I think the two great threats to us are first and foremost the threat of escalation leading to miscalculation. And then I think the other threat is this sort of insidious undermining of our way of life. And of course, that is something that we have to watch very carefully, because in trying to protect it, there's a real chance that we will actually undermine the very freedoms that we're trying to protect. Now, of course, our integrated review of foreign defence, security and international development policy that was published in March this year seeks to get after that. And it absolutely recognises that our security in the UK is assured through Europe. But it also recognises that this century is going to be the Asian century. And therefore, it does talk about a tilt to the Indo-Pacific. And I think we'll come back to that when we have some questions and we have a conversation in a moment. And then there are some big deductions and implications for us in the military. I mean, first and foremost, I think how we do strategy needs to be thought about. It's now, I think, in this competitive world, much more about multidimensional checkers. And I don't think our generation has ever had to deal with this. The last time this was a challenge was probably in the 30s and the 40s. And therefore, we've got to think about how we do that. And it means, I think, having a slightly different strategic culture, a different strategic posture, and perhaps a way of warfare, I put in parenthesis, that is fit for purpose for this sort of competitive age in which we live. And we are therefore talking about a slightly different form of deterrence in our operating concept. We're talking about active deterrence, which reflects the fact that we don't think in this world you can afford to be passive in terms of your deterrence posture and profile. We're talking about being integrated across all of the levers of national power, across the interagency, and indeed more broadly across the private sector. So the thing is much more of an enterprise in the way that we do it. We're talking about adding the word competition to the traditional paradigm of comprehension, credibility, capability, and communication. And through competition, what we're talking about here is, on the one hand, protecting our critical national infrastructure and our resilience. But we're also talking about engaging with allies and with partners. NATO is obviously at the core of this. But we increasingly think that the sort of ad hoc groupings that you could pull together around mutual interests is a way of looking at this, because we believe that if you force people to make choices between one bloc or the other, as perhaps George Kennan's long telegram led us to do, that will not be the answer in the world in which we find ourselves today. So ad hoc groupings around mutual interests, we believe, is the right answer to this. And of course, it's also about constraining, and we need to constrain our opponents in cyber and in space, and more broadly, from filling the strategic vacuums that we might leave in certain important quarters of the world. And those need to be filled, obviously, with the other instruments of national power, but the military has a role to play. And I've always been very struck by how our soft power is effective, and how our training and education systems and our brands, like the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst or the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, these are very popular with our natural partners. And making sure that our soft power is being applied sensibly is something that is at the heart of this as well. Escalation management needs thought. No longer is it up and down one single ladder. It's more like a spider's web of multiple ladders and multiple domains. And then we've got to reflect really hard, I think, on the evolving instrument of statecraft that is strategic communications. Very challenging in a democracy, but fundamentally matching your words and your deeds together in an agile way is going to be key to this. Now, I won't get into the detail of modernisation, because we're going to talk about that in our conversation. But a huge part of this is how you modernise your armed forces to make sure that they are offering the deterrence of hard power and the warfighting capability that underpins this competing that I'm talking about is pretty fundamental, and we'll come back to that. But to conclude, really, it does seem to me that victory is going to go to the side that is best able to integrate the domains of space, cyber, land, air, and maritime, because the total effect will be much greater than the sum of the parts. And that is about a digital backbone. It's about making it possible for your sensors, your effectors, and your deciders to be properly integrated into that digital backbone. Data at the heart of what we're talking about. It's also going to go to the side that probably adapts most quickly, because we can't predict the future. And that's why I always say it's about people. And for us, frankly, they are our adaptive edge, and they are what we must invest in. And when we talk about it, we talk about technology, process, but fundamentally it's about people. And to my mind, as the head of Britain's armed forces, people are my most precious asset, and how we invest in them fundamentally will give us the edge that we need for the world that I've described.
Thank you. That's an excellent overview of how the world has changed and the many difficult challenges that the democratic nations of the world face today, which is quite daunting and seems to require significant changes in terms of how we have operated, perceived, and plan to act in the future to make sure that conflict does not actually occur, let alone escalation. Before we go forward, which is, I think, where the focus of our conversation will be today, I wanted to first talk a bit about Afghanistan, which, as you mentioned, we left rather abruptly, and that it did not go as many had hoped in terms of the Afghan government remaining in power. How do you think we could have done things differently with the withdrawal?
Well, I mean, I think that, to be honest, you have to go back 20 years to the beginning. And I think you have to analyse quite carefully how the political objectives evolved during the course of the campaign. And what was a very clear set of political objectives at the beginning, which was fundamentally about getting after bin Laden and removing al-Qaeda, morphed into objectives that were more about nation building. And whether they went from a platform that was as well prepared as it might be, given the initial political objectives, I think is a very interesting question. So I think, you know, one has to look at the whole 20-year campaign, if I can call it that, and see how the political objectives evolved during the course of that campaign. And then I think one has to ask whether or not the political strategy on the ground led to the sort of solidity in nation-building terms that was necessary for a sustainable solution. So I suspect we will ask big questions about how we do nation-building, and I think we'll also ask big questions about how we do the capacity building of indigenous forces. Because what I think the Ides of AUKUS, as I often refer to them as, I think what that revealed was that it was very fragile. And I don't think even the Taliban predicted how fragile it actually was. And I think it's worth us reflecting on that, because if we are going to make a difference in terms of state building in the future, we need to think really hard about the lessons that we would draw from that.
That is very true, and that is very important. So turning to the future now, and a recent development in the Indo-Pacific region that has been a very exciting one that's gotten a lot of attention, which is the UK, the United States, and the Australian government announcement that they are going to jointly develop nuclear submarines through AUKUS, which is kind of a weird acronym to say. What do you think in the broad strategic environment prompted this decision and this movement towards joint development of submarines?
Well, of course, the initial proposition, of course, came from Australia, and you know, I think it was their recognition that the capability they were acquiring in terms of submarines wasn't what they felt they needed for the context in which they found themselves in strategic terms, and they felt that nuclear propulsion was more likely to give them the endurance, reach, and sustainability that they need. So it came from Australia to begin with, but of course, having said all of that, it was consistent with what we published in our integrated review. You know, this was about the tilt to the Indo-Pacific, and of course it was about you know, industrial cooperation. And what I was saying about, you know, the importance of relatively ad hoc groupings in which you are able to focus on your mutual interests to be able to make progress. So I think it resonated with what our integrated review was suggesting. And I think, you know, it therefore provides a prospect to achieve something that we might not have thought about in that way previously.
That's true. So the submarines have gotten the most attention from AUKUS because it was a big shift in terms of what the Australians were planning to procure in the near term. But AUKUS has other elements in it in terms of joint technology sharing. Do you think there are particular areas that you imagine this agreement moving in the future, or that it should go in?
Yes, I mean, I think the things that have been sort of stated publicly, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, cyber, and of course underwater capabilities are logical. And I think, you can see capability overlaps, particularly when you talk about the underwater piece. Both ourselves and the Australians, for example, share the P8, as does the United States. And of course, Canada and the Australians are acquiring our Type 26 frigate, which of course is an anti-submarine vessel. So I think there are obvious overlaps there. And I think, like all these things, we're going to see how it goes. I mean, I think there are some question marks about how we share information and those sorts of things, which I hope this could act as a catalyst for us all to be a bit more open-minded about how we share information with allies and partners, because that would be helpful.
Information sharing is one of those issues that frequently is an impediment to multilateral operations, let alone joint development of new capabilities. Are there other obstacles that you see in terms of preventing AUKUS from realizing its goals?
I mean, I think pace and industrial capacity are things that people will think about. And of course, as you know, the next 18 months, or I guess now the next 16 months, are going to be focused on how one makes sure that those sorts of things are properly put to bed. But yes, I mean, I think those are the two key issues and the things that we will be looking at clearly, because if this is to give real expression to what we're talking about, it needs to be delivered at a sensible pace.
So let's keep the focus on the Pacific for a little bit longer. And there have been some exciting developments recently in terms of British naval deployments to the region. The first time since 1997, the HMS Queen Elizabeth Carrier Strike Group deployed to the region, and you're planning to station 2 ships there permanently. So this is a part of this broader tilt to focus on the Indo-Pacific region, and realizing that this is where the chronic long-term challenge is stemming from. Can you talk about these developments and how you envision the British military presence evolving over the coming years?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that we've had a long-term association with the region. 19 of the 54 countries in Britain's Commonwealth are in the Indo-Pacific region. And we've always recruited a lot of servicemen and women from those countries as well, between 250 and 350 every year, which is large by our scale. We've always had around 350 Gurkhas who we've taken out of Nepal. And we've always done a lot of sort of training and education of their militaries, as well as the people that we recruit. So we've always had a pretty close connection. We, of course, have a number of alliances that we've always had there. So there's the Five Powers Defence Agreement, which is in its 50th anniversary this year. There's obviously the Five Eyes. And, of course, there's ASEAN, which we're closely associated with. And then we've always been involved in the various UN Security Council resolutions that are applicable to DPRK and everything associated with that. So we've had a long association. So we're going to build on that long association. And whilst I think one needs to be realistic that the deployment of a carrier strike group at the scale that the Queen Elizabeth Strike Group has demonstrated this year is probably going to be episodic, we will nonetheless build on that, because it's given us the opportunity to train both with American carriers but also with Australian, Canadian and New Zealand capabilities. We've had in the carrier strike group, we've had from time to time Dutch, Danish and German vessels. And of course we've paid visits, despite COVID, to Japan and to South Korea and to other friends and partners in the region. But I think realistically it's episodic, I would suggest. It's not going to happen every year. But the 2 warships that we're basing there now permanently, HMS Spey and Tamar, although they won't have a particular port they will adhere to because they're working on an agile support solution, the plan, of course, is that they will make it possible for us to have much more consistent relationships with our FPDA friends, but also with our broader defence relationships in the region. We very much hope that they will contribute, therefore, to the sort of security, stability and prosperity of the region. So that's the idea. On top of that, we're planning to base a littoral strike group of amphibious capability there from time to time. And again, that will build upon all of that. And I think we hope that things like our Jungle Warfare School, which is a first in class in Brunei, will be available to friends and partners as well in due course. So I think it's that sort of thing that we're talking about. So it's a mix of soft and hard power, but it's fundamentally about building upon long-term relationships, developing new partnerships, and ultimately it's all about improving security, stability, and recognising the multiple points of tension, of course, there are in the region. And if that can be resolved, then it's for everybody's prosperity that we all work together to achieve this.
Absolutely. So it sounds like you have a plan to establish a persistent presence that will be bolstered from time to time by episodic rotations to the region. Nonetheless, it's still pretty far away from the UK to go into the Indo-Pacific. And the United States faces challenges with this in terms of deploying forces routinely and the stress that it puts on them, the way that it degrades their readiness, and just maintaining that sort of presence can be very challenging. As you noted earlier, the acute security threat that the UK faces is at home in Europe with Russia. Do you have a plan for how you're going to balance the competing demands and this need to be present globally while managing threats closer to home?
I mean, again, we need to be realistic about what we can do. As I said a moment ago, our security is very much assured through Europe and particularly through the NATO alliance. So we don't in any way wish to diminish our contribution to the NATO alliance. Indeed, we want to increase it where we possibly can. And of course, we are one of the few powers that provides a multi-domain input to it, both in terms of cyber, land, air, maritime, to a degree, and evolving so in space, but also nuclear as well. And it is not our intention to change any of that. And of course, we may want to go into NATO a bit more, but the NATO alliance is evolving apace at the moment, which is, I think, which is exciting because it needs to be modernized to be able to deal not just with the threats that Russia are providing, but also the sort of 360 sense of what the NATO military strategy puts on the table. And that bears on things like violent extremism and terrorism and so on and so forth as well.
Turning to NATO, since you brought it up, do you think that NATO needs to be doing more in order to strengthen deterrence against Russia right now? And if so, what would you imagine it doing or the UK doing?
Well, I think the NATO military strategy I referred to a moment ago, that is evolving through what is a good concept for deterrence and defence in the Euro-Atlantic area, which was produced by SHAPE. I think the new NATO warfighting concept, which was produced by ACT in Norfolk, is also a step forwards. And of course, where we're now getting to are the sort of strategic plans and the family of operational plans that sit below those that SHAPE are producing. And of course, SACA's strategic directive, which of course tries to deal with what we call BACO, which essentially is peacetime operations, as distinct from crisis and conflict. So I think where I think we've got to evolve to is to recognise that there is a continuum between competition, crisis and conflict, and how you manage authorities' permissions and of course command and control throughout that continuum is of course the challenge in the world that I described in my opening remarks. I think we've also got to recognise that we need to incentivise allies to modernise. And I think there are question marks about the quadrennial process that sets political guidance and then leads into the NATO defence planning process. And does that provide incentivisation to allies perhaps to take risk for the short term in order to invest for the longer term? I'm not sure it necessarily does. And if we are going to genuinely move from an industrial age of platforms to an information age of systems, there needs to be a means that allies are incentivised to modernise in an effective way. And that, of course, is what the warfighting concept is focused on too. So I think that's important. And then I think we need to think quite hard about what 360 means. Because, of course, the world that I described is a world in which, deterrence and defence is not just going to be specifically within SACEUR's area of operations. There is the depth to that area of operations which is relevant. And we see that, with Belarus, we see it with Ukraine, we see it with North Africa and perhaps more the broader Middle East. Because, of course, our rivals are using those places as an opportunity to achieve their ends. And that has a bearing upon European security. So how you deal with the 360 challenge and how you deal with NATO's depth, again, is something that NATO's got to think about quite hard. And then, of course, there is the challenge of multi-domain. How do you integrate space, cyber, land, air, and maritime to achieve the total effect that we're talking about? And, I haven't even got into what it means to nuclear doctrine and things associated with that. So there's a lot for NATO to do, but I get the sense that people want to grip it. And I think that the challenge that President Macron laid down before the last NATO summit about NATO being brain dead is a challenge that people are up for trying to solve.
There is a lot of work for NATO to do in terms of war planning so that it can make that transition smoothly, or actually hopefully prevent that from ever occurring. At the same time, there are technical challenges and interoperability that you mentioned. One of the developments we've seen is with Europe now, there are more F-35s than anywhere else in the world, with 7 nations as well as the United States. And you see that having a common weapon system can be a baseline for interoperability. Do you think that this is going to help NATO and to work together and to operate together more effectively? And is it something that you would imagine seeing more of in the future?
Yeah, I think so. But I mean, I think we also need to recognize that for allies to want to invest in these capabilities, there's got to be a bit of sharing of the industrial development and the capability development around it. Because I don't think we can live in a world where things are simply acquired from one person. I think you need to have something where there's more of a collective sense of development and progress about it. I also think that, you know, whilst that sort of interoperability is very important, when I talked about the importance of a digital backbone as the means through which you are going to be able to integrate your deciders as well as your sensors and your effectors, you know, how that digital backbone underpins the way in which NATO will integrate in multinational and therefore interoperable terms is going to be pretty fundamental to what we do. And at the moment, I'm not sure we're entirely in the right direction on that. And we can make it happen. I mean, the Afghan mission network, which I spent several years of my life using in Afghanistan, was a step in the right direction. And I remember when I took over as a divisional commander in Regional Command South in Kandahar, you know, on day one, I needed 7 different means of communication to talk to my 7 different task forces, of which 3 were American, and they had different systems. By the time I left, the Afghan mission network had made it possible for everybody to talk to each other, putting it in simple terms. And that, I think, is at the heart of how we make this thing work.
The digital backbone is really important and is one of the challenges that we're facing within the U.S. Department of Defense across the services, because each service is pursuing its own solution and they're hoping to link up in the cloud, but it becomes exponentially more difficult when you begin to incorporate allies and partners and different authorities and classifications and issues. So that is definitely an important issue that needs to be figured out to be able to move forward and converge effects across domains, as everyone believes is really important. Let's turn to the UK and the modernization effort that you're undergoing right now. You're facing similar dilemmas to the US military in terms of grappling with issues about your force size and especially your ground force size, and the need to modernize your air and naval forces, which are critical to any future fight, in addition to space and cyber. What direction do you see modernization going in, and what can you tell us about it?
So I think we believe that the battlefield of the 2030s, and I think there are already indicators to support this, particularly what we saw with in Azerbaijan recently. But I think the indicators are that warfare is going to be increasingly about a competition between hiding and finding. And that has maybe major ramifications for the sorts of platforms that you're going to use within the system that you'll ultimately have to fight it through. And I think, you know, they're going to have to be more mobile. They're going to have to be able to hide much more in plain sight than perhaps they've done before. It'll have some interesting questions, I think, about some of the principles of war. You know, we used to talk about economy of effort and concentration of force. Concentration of force might well be a weakness in the future, given the way in which modern missile technology and systems that are designed to find you very quickly will perhaps illuminate you as a target, which would not be the way we need to go. So I think competition between hiding and finding. I think one's going to have to be very bold, as I was saying earlier, about sunsetting, therefore, certain capabilities which don't necessarily fit the hiding versus finding paradigm. And that will give you, hopefully, the headroom, if you're prepared to take the risk to do it, in order to be able to acquire what you need for sunrise. And we're in quite a fortunate position in the UK at the moment, because for the first time in living memory, we have some really quite clearly stated ends in terms of our integrated review. We're relatively confident about the ways in terms of our operating concept that's becoming doctrine. And also we've got a spending settlement that means that we're more confident about the means than we've been for a very long time. So with those in balance, we're in quite a good place to be able to take some bold decisions about sunsetting and sun rising. I think we need to recognise so much that this is going to be about speed. And remember Boyd's OODA loop. You know, the side that is quickest is going to win this fight. So I think the whole business of decision making, and that plays into the digital backbone, and of course it plays into data. And data is going to be, you know, the capability, frankly, if we're going to make this happen. I think we need to recognise it's going to be contested, and I think some of our fundamental assumptions are going to be challenged. You know, the extent to which our air forces will be able to fly from protected air bases in the future, the extent to which we can have assured logistics, the extent to which our command and control system will remain able to enable the sorts of conversations that we have at the moment. These are all assumptions that are going to be challenged, and we need to think really hard about what that means to the way in which we modernise. It's going to be a much expanded battle space, I guess, fighting much more reach, as we see with modern missile technology again. And I think at the heart of what we believe is this is about science and technology. Science and technology is a major determinant now of national power, and how you connect that with research and development and into a culture of experimentation that we probably haven't seen almost since the 1930s, which you can do in a much more imaginative way with the outside world. Because let's face it, this is going to be about information technologies, and it's going to be about a combination of information technologies. And putting that right combination together is going to require experimentation and collaboration with industry and the outside world in a way that I think our clunky acquisition systems don't allow for at the moment. And acquisition is going to have to change. You know, no longer, I think, can we have the luxury of setting a requirement, specifying it up the yin-yang, and then bringing on a competition. That ain't going to work. You know, somehow you've got to innovate together, and that's going to be a change to it. So I think our modernisation is along those sorts of lines. We've not answered the question specifically, but I think we know the sorts of things that it's going to have to take account of. And I think the idea of experimenting and putting it together in the way which we are is going to push it in a better direction.
That's definitely true. We're undertaking a project here at CNAS on the unfinished business and defense innovation that's looking at the issue of how the Defense Department can better link up with the private sector and the non-traditional defense space, because so much of the innovation is actually occurring outside of the agencies that are under the control of the department. You talked a lot about the lethality, just weapon systems becoming more lethal and the battlefield becoming a dangerous and expanded place. A lot of that has to do with missiles, but also unmanned systems and unmanned aerial vehicles. We've seen this in Armenia and Libya, in Ukraine. How do you see unmanned systems playing into the British military modernization going forward? And do you think this is a productive area for cooperation multilaterally?
Yes, to answer that part of the question, I definitely do. I mean, I think you know, all three of our traditional domains are looking at autonomy in a different way. I mean, it's obviously very clear in the air domain how important that's going to be. And when you look at our Tempest program, our Future Combat Air System Technology Integrator, I mean, that's got two interesting programs associated with unmanned technologies. Mosquito is one of them, and then one called Alvina is the other one. Mosquito will essentially be the sort of loyal wingman which supports the manned crewed platform, and Alvina will be about swarms of uncrewed systems, much smaller probably, that will provide the mass that you might want and need to be able to overcome some of the modern air defence systems associated with it. In the maritime domain, again, a lot of the subsurface technologies, it's quite clear that that's going to be autonomous. Where we're going with minesweeping in the maritime domain, definitely autonomous. Harder in the land environment, but I think we should also be clear that autonomy is going to have a role to play in that. I think it does beg some really interesting questions about ethics and where the human will be in the loop in all of this. And certainly I think in the West, in ethical terms, I think we believe there needs to be a human in the loop. But when you start to link this stuff to artificial intelligence, you know, there will be some big ethical questions, I suspect, that we'll need to think about in relation to the values that we apply to modern battlefields. So no, I'm sure autonomy is there. The uncrewed nature of what's on offer is definitely something that is going to be at the heart of what we do in the future.
Absolutely. Figuring out responsible artificial intelligence and autonomy is one of those really crucial questions that is so difficult, and especially when you tie it to the speed of the battlefield and you're expecting to need that decision advantage and that speed to be ahead of your adversary, it's hard to keep that human even on the loop. But you need to find ways to do so that ultimately it is human beings making the decisions. We've talked a lot about technology development and how it needs to be done more jointly so that different nations that are working together are invested in it and actually producing the different capability. What do you see as the future for joint technology development? Which areas do you think are most promising, or where you should move to next, going beyond AUKUS?
I think it's going to be about information technologies. So I think, AI, machine learning, how that plays into quantum and everything associated with that. It does seem to me that that's the area that we need to be collaborating on. It's quite obvious that some of our assertive authoritarian rivals are also focused on that. So it seems to me that there is an arms race that needs to be fixed on that. So I would have thought that's where I would focus my attention.
That makes sense. Everyone, keep questions coming in. We're going to turn to the audience in a few moments. So please, if you have questions, submit them in the chat box. Last thing, let's go to the far end of the conflict spectrum and talk about nuclear weapons a little bit. We've mentioned them in passing. It's obviously in the news a lot with recent tests we've seen and developments that have been exposed in China. Nuclear weapons play a prominent role in Russian strategy. We've seen North Korea has been very active lately, testing different missiles and potential nuclear weapons delivery systems. The integrated review received a lot of attention at the time because you had reversed prior plans to reduce the nuclear arsenal in the UK. How do you think that the United States, the UK, NATO need to ensure strategic stability going forward?
Well, I think the first and most important thing is we need to be bringing on a bit of an academic debate about this. I think the recently published Russian doctrine on launch on warning should cause us to think fairly hard about sole use and so on and so forth. And I think there's some big questions that need to be put out there for us to challenge and to think about and to educate people on. Next, I think we need to be clear that some of the developments in conventional missile technology make the whole business of escalation management a much grayer area than it was when I was growing up in the Cold War. And I think we need to reflect quite hard upon some of the thresholds associated with escalation management in relation to how that bears on nuclear. And I think that within NATO circles we need to bring on a conversation about what this means to NATO's doctrine. NATO is a nuclear alliance, the sort of the input to the NATO military strategy on nuclear is probably the bit that is least clear. So I think there's definitely a debate to be had about all of that. So no, I think it's right and proper at this stage, given the potential absent effective arms controls mechanisms that we remember from the past. It's definitely the right time to be bringing on a proper debate about this and working out what this means to our nuclear doctrine and capability development in the future.
It is. It's the one area you've seen NATO focus the least amount of attention thus far, a lot more focus on hybrid, gray zone, sort of the low end of the spectrum, and conventional deterrence and how to prevent the fait accompli. But I think you're absolutely right that it is the linkages between the two and the risks of escalation at the conventional to the nuclear level that is not well understood, where you have so many dual use systems, including command and control, and that is potentially a very scary dynamic if we don't plan for it and take steps to mitigate those risks. Okay, first audience question is coming from Sam, and he says that he thinks Japan feels sidelined by AUKUS, and how is Japan expected to take action in the frame of AUKUS going forward?
I think my comment on that would be that AUKUS is not designed to be in any way exclusive. It's a first step in terms of industrial development between like-minded partners, and I absolutely know that the architects of it reckoned that if it could be made more inclusive, if there were opportunities there, then that's the direction of travel it would go. You know, the same applies to Five Eyes and also to other like-minded countries.
Yeah. Japan obviously has a very capable undersea force of its own, though not nuclear in nature. I guess that is one of the challenges with the ad hoc groups of the willing. While it makes sense to work with partners that are willing and able to do so on particular issues and have shared interests there, that it does raise the issue about who's involved and who is not involved and how you diplomatically manage that. We have a question from John, who asks, if the UK's first focus is on Europe and Russia, does this mean a greater naval concentration to counter the Northern Fleet? And how does the UK intend to bolster NATO defenses in Southern and Eastern Europe, especially in the Black Sea?
Yes, I mean, I think it's broader than just NATO equals Russia. As I was saying, I think earlier in the conversation, it's also about terrorism. It's also about the 360 nature of what is happening around SACEUR's area of operation. So it is more broad than that. And you are right to focus on the maritime area. I think, you know, it's always been the case in terms of NATO military strategy, and of course the strategy of the Allies in World War II, that the North Atlantic remains absolutely fundamental for the ability of Europe to be reinforced from the United States and, for that matter, from Canada. It's also the case, of course, that the Northern Atlantic stretching up to the Arctic is going to be fundamental. And I think all of us are focusing our attention on the high north in a way that we wouldn't have done even 2, 3, 4 years ago. And you see that particularly with our allies who have land that butts onto it, whether that's Canada or the United States or Denmark or whomever else, or Norway. So I think you know, all of that is definitely a flank that we need to be thinking hard about. And when you see some of the capabilities that Russia has developed, you know, the Severodvinsk submarine and some of its deep undersea capabilities, we should be in no doubt that this is something that needs to be properly dealt with in capability terms, but also in deterrence terms.
That is definitely a challenge. Looking to the high north, there are so many physical challenges that make it so hard to operate as normal there, and that require special capabilities and technologies that aren't as useful in other areas. And it's hard to make investments in those very specialized types of systems that aren't going to have general applicability given constrained resources. But
yes, I think I probably would also go on to add to the answer to the question. I mean, one of the things the UK has been quite successful with over the last 5 years is what we call our Joint Expeditionary Force. And this is where we've brought together a multinational alliance of the 3 Baltic states. It's got the Scandinavians in it, so Sweden, Finland, Norway, Iceland and Denmark, but also the Netherlands. And this grouping of like-minded countries is very much focused, of course, on the region that it represents. But it's also oriented very much towards the maritime domain, but also to the high north. And I think the questioner also asked about the Black Sea. You know, and we should be in no doubt there that, you know, that might be NATO's depth, but the relationship that we have, certainly with Romania, for example, but equally the relationships that we're having with Ukraine and, of course, with other countries around the Black Sea, and particularly Turkey, are hugely relevant to the nature of the threat that we're talking about, whether that is Russia or indeed migration, and perhaps with migration violent extremism.
It seems to me that you're almost suggesting that there should be a coalition of interested states for the Black Sea region as well, to potentially focus efforts and activities there, in addition to the things that NATO as a whole is undertaking.
Well, possibly. I mean, we already have a Quint group that supports Ukraine, United States, Canada, Lithuania, and ourselves. And you know, maybe it's those sorts of things are going on issues of mutual interest where we can work together. But one has to be careful. I mean, the Black Sea there are all sorts of regional tensions associated with the Black Sea, and how you play into that needs to be quite thoughtful and indeed diplomatic, I would suggest.
Absolutely. The region also has all kinds of limitations about who can operate in the sea at what times and with what types of ships and capabilities that make it challenging. So we have a question here from Hugo, and he is noting that you suggested that we need to integrate support from the private sector into defense innovation and ask what you see as the immediate priorities in this area.
Yes, actually, funny enough, I'd go broader than just in terms of defense innovation. I also think we're going to have to go that way when it comes to skills. Because many of the skills that we're going to need, whether those, for example, data engineers and data scientists, you know, if we get, and obviously cyber skills, you know, I don't think we're going to be able to afford in professional military structures to be able to pay those sorts of people with what they probably can get in the outside world. So how you share those skills on more of an enterprise basis, and you get people to focus on, you know, what you're trying to achieve as part of your national objectives is going to be critical. And in terms of innovation, I mean, I just think that's the practical and pragmatic way of thinking about this. I mean, in the Cold War, it was the defense sector whence most of the innovation came from. And that, of course, is not the case any longer. You know, the tech sector is not inside the defense sector any longer, even if there are some bleed across. The reality is it's in the outside world. And if we're going to you know, provide the right adaptive edge in order to be able to modernize effectively, one's got to find a way of doing this on an enterprise basis with the outside world.
This takes us back to one of your initial opening remarks about people being the most important asset, and people with the right skills, digital skills, managing them for the 21st century, modernizing how the military does it, so you can tap into those folks with the expertise that you need to deal with the information sector. We have a question from Priam, who asks about the recent Chinese hypersonic test and what type of threat it poses to the US and the UK.
Well, I mean, I think the straight answer is we don't know yet. I mean, I think it was probably not a wake-up call for everybody, but it's an indication of how quickly this technology is evolving, and the extent to which, you know, some countries are, you know, pushing the edge on it. And I think, you know, it goes back to the depth of the conversation that you and I have just been having about how you relate hypersonics to the challenge of hiding versus finding, how you relate hypersonics to the way in which you're going to manage escalation in the future, how that plays into whether nuclear becomes appended to hypersonics. You know, these are all real challenges that military professionals and policymakers are going to have to be quite thoughtful about resolving. And how we deal with counter-hypersonics is quite clearly the inevitable game that we always play in the military world, isn't it? It's about you know, an advance and then a countermeasure. And all of that, of course, is going to be right at the heart of what we all do in capability development terms over the course of the next few years, I would suggest.
Hypersonics are one of those areas that it is clearly a defense technology that needs to be developed and to be in the lead of the development of it. But it is also one of those capabilities that's potentially destabilizing from a crisis stability perspective, though I do believe that there has been a little bit of unnecessary hype around hypersonics since all of our ballistic missiles already travel at hypersonic speeds. I think that having much faster cruise missiles is potentially
a game changer.
A new challenge, yeah. But that we don't have to necessarily overreact to these developments. We need to pay attention and keep up with them and think about how to manage them. I have a question from Christopher, who asks you if the integrated operating concept puts too much of the onus on the military to counter the complex hybrid threats coming from adversaries. Put another way, how much whole of government buy-in is there for the IOC?
That's a good question, and Christopher's exactly right that the sorts of environments in which we're trying to have an impact through that integrated operating concepts fundamentally depend upon all of the instruments of statecraft being integrated to achieve it. In the UK, I think we're by no means perfect, but we do have not a bad cross-government approach to strategy and to some of the responsiveness and agility necessary in the modern world to be able to deal with some of the problems that are arising. I mean, it is definitely not perfect, but the National Security Council, the National Security Secretariat that feeds it, how often it comes together, the issues it discusses, you know, I think we do provide pretty good holistic answers to strategic problems. The challenge, of course, is executing them through strategy, and that is a challenge, I think, for all democracies, not least ourselves. And of course, there's always a big challenge, as I touched on in my remarks, about strategic communications. Because of course, strategic communications, if they're going to be successful and, if you like, able to compete with the counter-narrative, have often got to test some of the traditional aspects of statecraft. And that is a problem for democracies, and is a problem, I think, that we have to resolve if we're going to be able to deal with the sorts of things that that question touches on.
Sounds like your government's a little bit ahead of us here in the United States in terms of bringing together at least interagency cooperation. Implementation's always the hard part, but even getting everyone on the same page seems to be a perennial challenge here, and one that we really need to figure out how to make some steps towards improving if we want to be able to compete effectively going forward. So I want to come full circle. We talked at the beginning about Afghanistan, and you had mentioned that the withdrawal from there might lead to a growing extremist threat. The United States views extremism as a threat, a lesser threat, a persistent threat that needs to be managed. What is the UK's approach to dealing with this issue?
Well, we've had, I think, quite a joined-up approach since 9/11, and particularly since our own 7/7, the terrorist attacks we had in 2007 in London, where we focus some of our effort, quite a lot of our effort, on prevent, because, of course, so much of dealing with violent extremism is about getting after the causes of violent extremism, and that's variably about education, a lack of employment opportunity, and a feeling of exclusion. So we focus on prevent. We focus, of course, on pursue, and we've all been doing that throughout the last 20 years, haven't we? And we also focus on, I think, trying to protect in terms of the population. And of course, I think the big questions that all of us need to ask in Western democracies is whether we've got sufficient national resilience in order to be able to deal with, as you describe it, being a persistent problem. And, I really don't want to go back to the future, but of course, when I was growing up, we had the threat in the UK from Northern Irish terrorism, and the population became remarkably resilient to Northern Ireland terrorism. And I fear that we've probably got to think a bit about managing the risks associated with international terrorism in that way. And clearly, there's a scale and a whatever type issue to it, but I think educating people that this is a problem that's not going to go away, and that we've got a generational task to try and get after the causes of it, is fundamentally what we need to be doing, I would suggest.
It's another issue that requires a whole of government approach and not just the military instrument, as we've seen, given successes and failures over the last 20 years. So I'd like to end with one question, turning to the United States. From your perspective in the UK, what would you like to see in the US National Defense Strategy?
I think I'd very much like to see allies and partners at the heart of this, because, as I said in my opening remarks, the great advantage that we have in the West, in the English-speaking world, with like-minded nations, the democracies, however you describe it, the bottom line is that it's about friends, it's about allies and partners, it's about a sense of a free and open way of life and a free and open world. And I think fundamentally, we've always had the United States leading us through that. And what I think all of us would like as the United States friends is that this strategy is based upon how we can turn that set of relationships into something that is genuinely a strategic response to the challenges that the world offers at the moment.
I think that is an excellent point, and one that hopefully the administration is listening to, the Biden administration, because one of the US's and the UK's unique advantages is that you actually have alliances and partnerships that are enduring and deep and go beyond just a marriage of convenience. So that seems to be one of the areas that they should try to leverage, because potential rivals and adversaries such as China and Russia don't have
No, they
that.
have clients. They don't have allies and partners.
Exactly. Well, General Carter, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a fantastic discussion. I hope that everyone has enjoyed it, and have a good afternoon.
No, well, Stacie, thank you very much. I much enjoyed it too.